Depression is Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of Franklin D. Roosevelt. She was an influential First Lady in American history, and she made a very significant impact during her time in the White House.
She was born in 1884 in New York City. She grew up in a very wealthy New York-loving family, but donated much of her time to community service. At a young age, she suffered much loss, as she lost both her parents before the age of 10, and one of her brothers died at the age of 9. That didn't stop her from achieving her goals later in life.
In 1929, she was the governor of New York, and in 1933, during the Great Depression, she began her First Lady duties. She was known for her involvement in human rights and equality rights for all genders and races. Her determination and perseverance to make the world a better place for all humans sets her apart from past and present First Ladies.
Throughout her time as First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt was significant to American society through her work in women's rights, advocacy for war refugees, and for recognition of African American rights.
Now we'll cut to Maddie DeMello, who's reporting live from Washington, D.C. about women's issues.
Eleanor Roosevelt was highly committed and tirelessly worked in hopes of obtaining full recognition of women equality through her participation in American politics. To begin, Eleanor Roosevelt worked very hard to keep women involved in establishing and evaluating the New Deal. She assembled a list of women she believed were qualified for executive-level positions, and she urged the Roosevelt administration to hire them. Should their suggestions not get a fair hearing, as one from a man would have, she did not hesitate to take their ideas directly to FDR. Eleanor had the opportunity to take advantage of her position in the White House to be the voice for all women in American society. This allowed for a more equal, even-rounded representation within the White House. Her ability to voice women's opinions and ideas helped to avoid the overshadowing that typically occurred from the dominating opinions of powerful men, significantly impacting American society. Secondly, in 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt published her first book as First Lady, titled It's Up to the Women. In this novel, Eleanor is a strong female author who speaks to all the women, dictating advice and words of strength during the Great Depression. Eleanor states, "A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong it is until it's in hot water." This goes to show as an example of how Eleanor spoke to the strength of women and how one is not to underestimate females as a whole. This novel was a very large step forward in 1933 for women, as a powerful and well-known figure in society was speaking out for all of women and shining light on their strength. This novel also contains advice and messages that remain true to this very day. Therefore, this novel written by Eleanor Roosevelt has greatly impacted society. Lastly, Eleanor Roosevelt was the writer of a 6-day-a-week newspaper column entitled My Day. In this column, Eleanor discussed topics that were considerably unspoken about, such as women in the workplace, women in the war, and equal rights. This column allowed society access 6 days a week to fresh discussion about topics that were typically unspoken of. This would have been a great push forward in the progression for women's rights, as someone so high in the public eye, speaking to such great issues, truly worked towards uplifting women equality and has impacted society to this very day.
Now we'll cut to Aoife Murray in Atlanta, Georgia, reporting on African American rights.
The First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, heavily fought for civil rights with African Americans. Eleanor Roosevelt pushed for the inclusion of African Americans in government programs. After the Federal Housing Administration built more walls in the Jim Crow era of segregation than tear down, many African Americans were still suffering from the Great Depression and were not able to receive services from the administration. With the inclusion of African Americans in government programs, they were able to benefit from the Recovery Program, PWA Housing Division, and Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was an educational program. These programs have helped include blacks in the community and let them receive the help every American deserves. By Eleanor Roosevelt helping African Americans be included in these very needed government programs, it showed all Americans that blacks need to be recognized by each other and they need to be able to receive equal programs and equal pay. This made an impact on society by showing Americans for more inclusion for those who needed help. Since African Americans were probably the hardest hit in the Great Depression, it made having money for them very hard. These programs helped them build a life onwards and help them succeed further in the future. Secondly, Eleanor Roosevelt helped out with the creation of the New Deal, which greatly benefited African Americans in that time period. The New Deal helped provide financial aid to African Americans towards the end of the Depression, as well as many others. The Great Depression was extremely difficult to African Americans. The new programs under the New Deal employed African Americans such as Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, and Public Works Administration. The education programs taught more than 1 million African Americans how to write, and if they were more skilled, they could be hired as engineers, librarians, lawyers, and architects. This was the first time that any deal made by the president helped out the African American community into any federal programs. It changed the way African Americans' lives in a positive way because they were taught how to read and write and given many educational programs to thrive off of. They were employed and hired as people such as engineers, librarians, and lawyers. This gave them a platform for future success. Eleanor Roosevelt took many actions to fight for the rights of African Americans. Eleanor Roosevelt changed society for many African American children who weren't allowed to attend white schools by helping organizations stick up and advocate for their rights when they didn't have a platform to do so. She made statements about how African Americans should be treated equally by resigning from a famous singing group because they didn't let in a black woman. Because of her high standing, that created social awareness and civil rights for African American people. This highly changed the way American people think about African Americans and their civil rights.
Now we will cut to Madeline Ballin reporting live in Chicago, Illinois on advocacy for war refugees.
As well as working with women and African American rights, Eleanor Roosevelt spent much of her time as First Lady advocating for war refugees. Her husband's time in office lined up with World War II, giving her many opportunities to help refugees coming from Europe. As Nazism spread across Europe, Miss Roosevelt did what she could to help Jewish refugees flee Nazi Germany. On multiple instances, Eleanor personally sponsored refugees in order to use her wealth and privilege to change the lives of the less fortunate. The First Lady also donated all her proceeds from her My Day newspaper column to organizations such as the American Friends Service Committee, who helped European war refugees. Additionally, Eleanor Roosevelt rescued children from war-torn countries by setting up a meeting in 1940 with powerful individuals such as government officials, social workers, and representatives from refugee aid organizations. Her efforts resulted in the U.S. Committee for Care of European Children, along with religious organizations, establishing a plan to bring orphans and unaccompanied children to America. Finally, the First Lady allowed a boat of refugees who refused asylum in Mexico to disembark in America against government officials' orders. Through aiding war refugees during World War II, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was very significant to American society.
To recap this segment, on a remarkable First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt made great strides in the human rights movement.
She used her powerful position and ability to influence a nation to enact change in American society.
Her influence on feminist issues, involvement in African American rights, and advocating for war refugees has led her to become one of the most influential and significant First Ladies. See you next time, Liberty lovers! We did it.